Hello everybody and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video, and this time it will be about ASP.NET Core service lifetimes. And guys, I think that this is a very important topic because in my day-to-day job I also do interviews with developers, .NET developer of course, and unfortunately I have to realize that whenever I ask about service lifetimes in .NET Core, there are very few developers that actually understand what those lifetimes really mean and how we can use them to our advantage, and what the pitfalls are of configuring or of using services with different lifetimes in different scenarios. And this is very important, and that's why I think that it is best to create a video on this topic. And one more important thing. Probably I sound a little bit cocky right now, but I guess that this might be one of the best videos that you might ever see about ASP.NET Core service lifetimes, because actually what we'll do here is not a theory at all. Everything that I want to try to explain, I will showcase using examples, or using some different examples and scenarios in a real Razor Pages app. And this is really important because we'll go also into the pitfalls of not understanding how actually lifetimes work for services in ASP.NET Core, and we'll also generate some error messages that I see very often when different developers are working with different type of services. So let's get started with this. Now, before we go to the coding part, I just want to outline a very basic theory, and this is the only theory that you will hear about in this exact video. So I would like to explain what actually those lifetimes are. First of all, we have three lifetimes actually or lifetime types for an ASP.NET Core application, and let's take them one by one and explain them in a very few words, and then we'll go into showcase what actually this really means in practice. So the first type of lifetime is the scoped lifetime or scoped services. Now, scoped services are actually resolved per each request in ASP.NET Core. What this actually means is that whenever a request comes in, a new instance for the scope service is actually created. So when you inject it in your controller, for each request, that instance will be different. Then when it comes to transient service, this is the second type. Transient services are resolved whenever you need them. So whenever you want to inject them somewhere, ASP.NET Core or the DI container will resolve that specific service. So we could say that they are resolved, or you get a new instance, a fresh new instance of the service. Whenever you need it, you get a new one. And then the singleton lifetime is probably also the most, or the easier one to understand, is the singleton. And the singleton is that the DI container creates one instance of that service the first time that it is required, and then that specific instance will be reused throughout the entire lifetime of the application, which means that no matter how many requests you have, you will always get exactly the same instance for that specific service. And as said, that is actually all the theory that I wanted to tell you today. And the rest of the video will be only practice, and will showcase how this actually works, what those lifetime mean actually, and what common pitfalls can we run into if we don't understand exactly how those lifetimes work. So let's get started. And before we really go to implement some services, I have here a Razor Pages project. And I have already added some kind of stuff to this project, actually the basic setup that we will need throughout our video, but you'll see that the implementations and how we register services and how we really test them and how we test the lifetimes we'll do directly here in this video, but the setup is already done. The setup contains one middleware, which is actually a very simple middleware. Right now it's actually empty, it doesn't do anything, it just returns next and passes the HTTP context to the next middleware in that pipeline. Now we have registered this middleware here in the configure method, of course, right after the if is development environment. So here we use our middleware. So this is the first part of the setup. Then the second part of the setup is I have already created some services. I have created an interface, which is this I operation interface. And then I have created several other interfaces like I operation transient, I operation scoped, and I operation singleton. And we have here a service class, which is operation that implements all of them. And what it actually does, this service, it's nothing really complicated, but it really helps us a lot to understand how this lifetime works. It just creates a new GUID and sets that as a property for this, or as a value for this operation ID. Now, if you are maybe at the beginning stages of your software development career in .NET Core, you might find this a little bit complicated, but I can assure you it's not. If you don't understand what exactly is what with all these interfaces, I just want to say that the basic concept is that we want to have this operation service, but we will add it, or we will register it in a configure services actually, using different type of interfaces. And that's why we'll register it once as transient, once as scoped, and once as singleton. And we'll be able then to see exactly what type of things happen. Now let's actually do this. So let's go here to the startup. Let's go to the configure services method. And here we'll actually do what we need. And in order, since we have a lot of ground to cover and not to really waste a lot of time me writing code, I will just reuse some code that I have already written and will actually explain that. We just have to use this, and we also need to add this one, and it should be okay. So as said, even if it seemed a little bit complicated, the main idea is that we get this operation service or class, and we register it once as singleton, then we register it as a transient, and then we register it as scoped. Remember, once again, singleton service are resolved once they are required for the first time, and then they are shared throughout the entire lifetime of the application. You have always the exact same instance. Transient services, once again, are only resolved when they are required. So whenever you require a transient service, you get a fresh baked copy of that specific instance, or a fresh new object, let's say. And then the add scoped, just to summarize once again, we add the service, or we get a new instance of that specific class, in this case operation, each time a new request comes in. So let's try to add some logging into different places of this setup that will allow us actually to see exactly what this lifetime really means. So let's get started with that. And first of all, let's go to our middleware class. And here, if we want to go to our middleware class, let's just 1 second. And here we will also, I will add here, as once again iLogger, we have to add also the usings for that. Then I operation transient, and that should do it. And of course, we need to also add those to the constructor, and we will do this. And here there is already a first thing, but let me also, I want to inject the scope service. So I operation scoped. I want to inject it in the invoke method, and we'll actually cover this right now. So the first very important thing about lifetimes is that when you have your custom middleware, you can register transient and singleton service, or you can inject them in the constructor, but scoped services, you need to inject them in the invoke method. So very, very important stuff here. And why is that actually? Well, the answer is because of the lifetime and how the startup of a .NET Core project actually works. Because as we know, when the application starts, well, we enter that program and class and the main method, we create the web host builder and things like that. And while we do that, the host actually calls the configure services method that configures the services, and it also calls the configure method that registers the middleware. Now, when it registers the middleware, it of course uses the constructor of the middleware. Now, remember the theory. Singleton services are created once they are required for the first time, and then they are reshared throughout the entire lifetime of the application. So this is why here in the constructor of this middleware, we want or we need this service for the first time, so an instance gets created. Now, the transient services, as outlined, are created once they are requested. So when the host actually tries to register this middleware, well, then it says, okay, I need an IOperation transient. So let's create a fresh new object of type IOperation and everything works fine. However, if we would try to add a scoped service here, since this method or this constructor is called by the host without an active request, so we don't have at this specific time an active request, if we try to inject a singleton service in the constructor of this middleware, then it will simply fail and we will get an exception. And this is surely something that we don't want to have. And that's the reason why we can inject scope services in the invoke method, because the invoke method is then afterwards called whenever a request comes in and needs to pass through the entire middleware pipeline. So by that time we have a request, and therefore we also have an instance of this scope service. And this is once again the reason why in a custom middleware, singleton and transient services you can inject in the constructor of the middleware, but scope services you need to inject here in the invoke method. Now, of course, let's add some new code here. We'll actually add only very few stuff. So we add here the logger, we add the transient operation, and we add the singleton operation. And then in the invoke method, we'll actually do only some logging, because this logging will help us a lot to understand how this lifetime works. So we just will log some information. First of all, we specify that this log is coming from the middleware, and we specify that it is the transient, and then we get the operation ID. Then for all the other services, we go actually for the same procedure. We specify that, okay, this log was done in the middleware for the scope service, and then we get the operation ID from the scope service, and then we do exactly the same for the singleton service. And I guess you already can imagine that based on the value of the ID that we will have at each step, we will be able to see exactly how the lifetime of the services actually works. But before we actually run the application, I want to do exactly the same thing also in another place, because that would allow us to see exactly how a transient service actually behaves. So let's go to the index.cs.html, which is the page model. And of course, we'll also need to add here some stuff. The logger we already have. So I will add here some private fields for the services. Of course, I need to add also the usings, and that should work right now. Okay, and then in the constructor, I also need to assign those. So let's do this. So we do the assignment here. Of course, we also need to add them to the method. Sorry for that. Let's we already have the logger, so we just need the other three services. So we just inject them here. Good. Now, what we can do here is on the onGet, we'll do exactly the same thing that we did in the middleware, but in this case, our logs will simply say that, okay, these logs come from the page model. And once again, for the transient service, we show the operation ID. Then for the scope service, we show once again the operation ID. And then once again for the singleton service, we share the operation ID. So let's run the application, and we'll be able to see in the logs, and we'll be able to discuss actually and find out or see in action how this service lifetime actually really works. So let me, okay, this application has now started. I won't open it. Let me change here the output. I want to have the output from the application. Okay, and here we get a lot. We have different type of information here. Okay, we have from Microsoft hosting lifetime, but then we see that we start to have the logs actually from our middleware. So we have the middleware for the transient service. So we have this GUID. For the scope service in the middleware, we have this other GUID. And then for the singleton service, we have this GUID, which is actually cool. Now let's compare it to what we have in the page model. So the transient, as I said, we get a new instance every time that it is required. So we required it one time in the constructor of the middleware, and we required it for a second time in the constructor of the page model. So if we compare this transient from the page model with the transient from the middleware, we see that the GUIDs are different. So we have this transient lifetime. Once again, it creates a new instance each time that that specific service is required. So we required it once in the middleware, we have one GUID, so one instance. And when we required it in the page model, we get another GUID. Now let's go to the scoped one. So for the scoped one in middleware, we have this GUID, and the scoped one in the page model, we have this GUID, which are equal. And why are they equal? Well, because they are both tied to a request. When a request comes in, it first flows through the middleware pipeline, but it is already related to the request, so we already have that specific scoped service. And then eventually it arrives at our page model and in this onGet method, but it is the same request. So we have exactly the same instance. Now for the singleton service, we see that we have it in the middleware, we have this GUID, and then in the page model, we have the exact same GUID. And since this is a Razor Pages application, probably there were separate requests for some CSS files or things like that. So we have some new logs from the transient, and we see that actually those are for a new request. So we have a totally new GUID for the transient service. We have here, once again, it is the same because it's actually logged in the same middleware. But then for the scope service, we see that we have a different request. We have a different GUID and things like that. So we had several different calls, but I guess you can already see that the scope service is for each request a different one. The transient service is actually every time it is required, it has a new instance and therefore a new GUID. And the singleton service, it has always the same instance, so we have always the same GUID. And I guess that proves, or that shows exactly what this lifetime or the service lifetime actually means in a .NET Core application. Now, this is pretty straightforward and it seems very easy. However, there are some common pitfalls that we can tackle when we develop an application. And the main reason why we can actually fall into these pitfalls is that we can actually, or that usually we have services which are registered or required or injected actually in the constructor of other services. And of course, if the lifetime of those specific services has a problem, or we have a problem with it, or they don't correspond, or one service has a longer lifetime than the other that is injected, we could get some error message. And in order to show this, actually, let's set up a few other things. And for this, we have actually these three different other services, my scope services, which are actually empty. We don't need anything else in them. We just need to register them and then to show what errors could we have in different circumstances. Then we have a my transient service and a my singleton service. So let's go in the startup file and also register those, of course, corresponding to the names that we have chosen. So we add the my scope service as scoped, we add the my transient service as transient, and we add the my singleton service, of course, as singleton. Now let's try to do the following thing. let's go to the my singleton service. Remember the singleton service, it gets created, or an instance for the specific class gets created whenever it is required for the first time, and then actually it is shared throughout the entire lifetime of the application. So let's come here, and we want to inject in the my singleton service, we want to inject the my scope service, which is a scenario that we could easily have in a different type of applications, because we very often inject services in other services. So let's try to also, so we say that we need here this dependency. Now let's go one step further, and let's go to the page model actually here. And we just want to inject in the page model also the my service. My singleton service, and let's call it singleton. I guess it should be correct. I just need to add the using to it. And once again, we don't need to do anything with the service, because just by injecting it here, it would actually create a new instance for that one. So let's add here, as said, this my singleton service. And once again, in this my singleton service, we actually try to inject this my scope service. So let's run the application and see what happens. So in this case, we see that the application starts, and bang, we got an error. And let's look at the exception that we get here. And it says that some services are not able to be constructed. Error while validating the service descriptor service type. And here we get that my singleton service lifetime is singleton implementation type. And once again, my singleton service cannot consume scoped service. And as said, that's a really very popular pitfall that a lot of developers get. And the reason why this happens is that, of course, since the lifetime of the scoped service is shorter than the lifetime of the singleton service, we cannot simply inject scoped services in singleton services. Now, of course, you will ask, okay, but I have scenarios in real applications where I need scoped services in a singleton service. And for this thing, we'll have a totally separate video, because it is a very, very important topic. And the answer to this problem, or the way to proceed if you are in this scenario, is actually very common for different type of scenarios where you have background services, where you want to maybe use already services in the configure services method or in the startup class and things similar to that. But once again, the idea is that you cannot use, or you cannot inject services that have a shorter lifetime in services that have a longer lifetime. It will always result in an error message. Now, okay, let's try to prove this theory once again. And let's just change here a little bit. And instead of my scoped service, I want to inject in my singleton service the transient service. So it would be my transient service. Okay, and let's run the application. I would say that in this case, the application should start normally. And why is this happening? Well, once again, because when we say that services with a shorter lifetime cannot be injected in services with a longer lifetime, it actually depends. Because in case of the transient service, remember the theory once again, we get a new object of that specific service whenever it is required. So do we require it in a singleton service? No problem, here it is. So that's why consuming a transient service in a singleton service is actually possible. And now let's look at another scenario which actually is once again very, very popular. I see it very, very often, and it is also the perfect example that showcases that a lot of us developers get or understand this idea of lifetime service, the idea of services lifetime in ASP.NET Core totally wrong. Let's go here in the my transient service. So once again, it's the transient service, and let's inject here my scope service. because once again, and let's go also to the index here, and instead of the singleton, I want to inject the my transient service, because this is the service that I'm actually using right now. Let's also change this name here. Once again, we don't need to do anything with the service. The simple fact that we actually try to register this service here already helps us to prove our point. So once again, we try to actually inject a scoped service into a transient service. Once again, a transient service is created, an instance is created whenever it is required. Therefore, it could have actually maybe a longer lifetime, although it depends on where you inject it, for how long do you use it, and things like that. And then we have the scoped service, which is once again scoped to a specific request, and we try to inject that service here in this index view model. So let's run this application. Now, if we start the application, we can see, or I can see, but you see that there is no exception, that the application started correctly. So you might ask yourself, how is that even possible? And the answer to that is that once again, when you come here, so this is actually the first time that this is the place where you require this my transient service. Now, this transient service requires a scoped service, which is the my scoped service. But we are here in the context of a request, because a request actually arrived here, and this means that by the time we resolve or we create a new instance, or the DI container creates a new instance of this my transient service, the scope service is also already there. So this is why we can actually inject it here in this case. But you would say, oh, but this is working, everything is fine. Let's go ahead and use this type of approach. However, this approach is totally wrong from my point of view, because let's also show how we can prove that. And let's move to the middleware once again. And as said previously, theory is that you can inject singleton and transient services in the middleware constructor. So this is exactly what I want to do. I want my transient service here in this middleware. And since it is a transient service, as said the theory, we can inject it in the constructor. So once again, when we injected this service in the page model, well, what it happened is that everything worked fine. But let's run the application right now to see if everything still works fine. And bang, we have an error message. And if we look into this error message, we see that it's exactly the same that we had also previously. And here the transient service, it requires the scope service, which is the myScope service. So how comes that when we did inject it in the page model, everything worked fine, but when we inject it in the constructor of the middleware, we suddenly got the error? And the response, the answer to this is, of course, well, because of the lifetime. As said, when we were in the index page model, actually, when we arrive here, we are already in the context of a request. And this means that we have also the myScope service. But when the application starts and tries to register the middleware, we are not in the context of the request. We don't have any request yet. It's just the host trying to start up the application. And then it tries to register this middleware. It uses, of course, the constructor and tries to resolve or to create an instance of the transient service, which is okay. But then the transient service needs the scope service. And since we are not in the scope of a request, well, of course, the scope service is not there. So we cannot use it. And then, of course, you would say, okay, that's easy, but okay, let's move this one. Let's inject this one in the invoke method instead of the constructor. And I would tell you, no, this is once again wrong. It is a workaround that proves that we don't understand exactly how those lifetimes are supposed to work. And this workaround really doesn't help us to understand what happens and really troubleshoot or understand our application, the way that our application is supposed to work. And as developers, we need to know that. So the idea is that in order to resolve this problem, we are back at what we discussed when we tried to add a scope service in a singleton service. There is a way to do that, and I promise you I will create a video in which we'll tackle only that specific challenge, because as I say, it is common for different type of scenarios, and I would like to take a look at all those scenarios and show you how we can resolve this problem in a proper way, not using a workaround like injecting a myTransient service here in this case in this invoke method. And yeah, I guess that's mostly it for the service lifetimes. Let's do a short summary of what we covered today. So first of all, we said that singleton services are, we get a new instance of the specific service the first time when that service is required, and then we get always the same instance throughout the entire lifetime of the application. For transient service, we get a freshly baked object every time it is required, no matter where. In middleware, in the constructor of the middleware, in the controllers, in the page model, wherever we require it, we get a fresh new instance of it. And then we have the scope services, which are, as said, tied to the context of the request, at least in ASP.NET Core. Of course, when it comes to Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly or even .NET Core desktop application, things are a little bit differently, but probably we'll have videos in which we'll tackle different or we'll discuss the behavior of lifetimes in other .NET Core project types like Blazor or .NET Core desktop application. But once again, this is the behavior that we have in ASP.NET Core. Then the next very important point, singleton services and transient services you can inject in the constructor of custom middleware, but scope services you need to inject in the invoke method of that custom middleware. Then a third point in this summary is don't try to add, for instance, scope services into singleton services or scope services into transient services, because you will get error messages. In the case when you try to add a scope service to a singleton, you will get an error right away. But in case that you actually inject a scope service into a transient service, as we have seen, there are scenarios where actually the request for the transient service actually corresponds with a request that is actually processed by the ASP.NET Core application. And in that case, we won't have any error. But as we have seen when we try to inject that transient service in the constructor of the middleware, which gets called when the application starts up, so we have no request at all. Well, in that case, as we have seen, we get the error. And please, once again, don't be misled by this, or don't be misled by that. This is a very, very important topic, and the workaround is not to simply move the injection of the myTransient service in the invoke method. And this being said, thank you very much for watching. I hope it was useful for you. It would be very, very highly appreciated if you think this content might be useful for your colleagues, your friends, whoever you might know. Just don't be shy and share this content in your social networks, at work, in your teams, whatever you're using. Whenever you think that this might be useful, just share it. And also, very important, please hit the thumbs up button. That would be highly appreciated. And of course, subscribe if you didn't do already. We do plenty of videos here related to .NET Core mostly. We do a lot of live coding sessions, and I guess you might find some useful things here if you check back from time to time. So it would be really appreciated if you take just a few seconds to subscribe to this Code Wrinkles channel. Well, this being said, once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.